The blood on Grace Rivera's hands wouldn't wash away, no matter how hard she scrubbed them raw in the creek that ran behind the abandoned homestead where she had been hiding for 3 days. She knew the stains were only in her mind now, that the water had long since carried away the physical evidence, but the memory of what she had done clung to her skin like a second shadow. She had killed a man in Santa Fe, shot him dead when he tried to force himself on her after she refused his advances at the saloon where she worked serving drinks. And now she was running as far as her stolen horse could carry her into the Colorado territory. The year was 1878, and women like her, women with pasts that followed them like vultures circling carrion, had few places to hide in a land that was still being carved out of wilderness and violence. Grace was 23 years old, and she felt ancient, as though every terrible thing that had happened to her had added years to her bones that her face didn't show. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves down her back, and her green eyes held a wariness that made most people look away when they met her gaze. She had learned young that the world was not kind to women who had no protection, no family, no husband to speak for them. She rode into Montrose, Colorado on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun was beating down mercilessly and turning the dirt streets into rivers of dust. The town was small but growing, with a main street lined with wooden buildings that still smelled of fresh cut pine, and a church at the far end with a white steeple that seemed to point accusingly at the sky. Grace kept her head down as she guided her exhausted horse toward what looked like a boarding house, her stomach tight with hunger and her throat parched from days of rationing her water. She didn't notice the man watching her from outside the general store until she had already dismounted and tied her horse to the hitching post. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and hands that looked like they could break a man in half without much effort. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and fell to his collar beneath a worn hat that had seen better days. His eyes were an unusual shade of blue, pale as a winter sky, and they tracked her movements with an intensity that made her want to run. Vincent Zarelli had been in Montrose for 2 years, working as a ranch hand for the biggest cattle operation in the area. But he had his own plans to buy land and start his own place once he had saved enough money. He was 27 years old and had spent most of his life learning how to survive in a world that rewarded strength and punished weakness. He had seen plenty of women come through Montrose, some looking for husbands, others running from something, and he had learned to tell the difference at a glance. The woman who had just ridden into town was running. Everything about her screamed it, from the way she kept looking over her shoulder to the tension in her spine that made her look like a deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Vincent found himself walking toward her before he had consciously made the decision to move, his boots crunching on the hard, packed dirt. "You look like you could use a meal," he said when he was close enough for her to hear him without him having to shout. His voice was deep and rough from years of breathing dust and shouting orders at cattle, but he kept it gentle because he didn't want to spook her. Grace's hand went instinctively to the gun she had tucked into the waistband of her skirt, hidden beneath the loose fabric of her blouse. She turned to face him, and Vincent saw the fear in her eyes before she managed to mask it with defiance. "I can take care of myself," she said, and her voice was hoarse from disuse. "Didn't say you couldn't," Vincent replied, holding his hands up slightly to show he meant no harm. "But the boarding house there doesn't serve food, and the restaurant is 3 buildings down. Thought you might want to know before you wasted your time." Grace studied him for a long moment, trying to decide if he was a threat or just being friendly. She had learned the hard way that men were rarely just being friendly, that there was always something they wanted in return for their kindness. But she was so hungry that her hands were shaking, and she knew she needed to eat soon or she would collapse. "Thank you," she said finally, the words stiff and formal. Vincent nodded and turned to walk away, but something made him stop and look back at her. "Name's Vincent Zarelli," he said. "Most folks call me Vince. If you need work, the saloon is always looking for girls to serve drinks, and the general store sometimes needs help with inventory." "I don't need your help," Grace said, but her voice lacked conviction. She watched him walk away, his long strides eating up the distance, and felt something twist in her chest that might have been regret or longing or just exhaustion. She couldn't tell anymore. She managed to get a room at the boarding house, using the last of her money. And then she went to the restaurant Vincent had pointed out and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, which turned out to be a bowl of stew that was more water than meat, but was still the best thing she had tasted in days. She ate slowly, making it last, and tried to figure out what she was going to do next. The problem was that she had no plan beyond getting as far away from Santa Fe as possible. She had no skills beyond serving drinks and cleaning floors, and she knew that those kinds of jobs would put her right back in the same situation she had fled from. Men who thought they could take whatever they wanted because she was just a saloon girl, just a woman with no one to protect her. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice someone sliding into the seat across from her until a hand waved in front of her face. She looked up, startled, and found herself staring at Vincent Zarelli again. "You following me?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "It's a small town," Vincent said with a shrug. "Not many places to eat. Mind if I join you, or would you rather I sit somewhere else?" Grace wanted to tell him to leave her alone, but something about his steady gaze made her hesitate. He didn't look at her the way most men did, like she was something to be used and discarded. He looked at her like she was a person, and that was so unexpected that she found herself nodding before she could think better of it. Vincent ordered his own meal and then leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unsettling pale eyes. "You running from something?" he asked bluntly. Grace stiffened, her hand moving toward the gun at her waist again. "That's none of your business." "Probably not," Vincent agreed. "But you should know that the sheriff here is a decent man. If you're in trouble, he might be able to help." "The law doesn't help women like me," Grace said bitterly. "It just makes things worse." Vincent was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you mean by women like you?" Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You know what I mean. Women who work in saloons, women who have to fend for themselves, women who don't have husbands or fathers to speak for them. The law doesn't care what happens to us." "That's not true everywhere," Vincent said carefully. "Maybe it was where you came from, but Montrose is different. The sheriff here, Tom Garrett, he's fair. He doesn't let men get away with hurting women, no matter who they are." Grace wanted to believe him, but she had heard promises like that before, and they had always turned out to be lies. She looked down at her half-empty bowl of stew and said nothing. Vincent's food arrived, and they ate in silence for a while. Finally, he said, "I meant what I said earlier. If you need work, I can put in a word for you at the general store. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, is a good woman. She won't treat you poorly." "Why are you helping me?" Grace asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "What do you want in return?" Vincent met her gaze steadily. "Nothing. I'm just trying to be decent." "Men are never just trying to be decent," Grace said flatly. "There's always something they want." Vincent felt a flash of anger at that, not at her, but at whatever had happened to make her so certain that kindness always came with strings attached. "Well, maybe I'm different," he said quietly. "Or maybe you've just been around the wrong kind of men." Grace didn't have an answer for that, so she finished her stew in silence and then stood up to leave. Vincent watched her go, and something in his chest tightened at the defeated slope of her shoulders. He told himself it was none of his business, that he had done what he could by offering help, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed more than just a job and a meal. Over the next few days, Grace did take Vincent up on his offer and went to the general store to ask about work. Mrs. Patterson was indeed a kind woman, in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She looked Grace over with a shrewd gaze and then nodded. "I can use someone to help with stocking shelves and keeping track of inventory," she said. "Pay is 50 cents a day, and you can start tomorrow if you're willing." Grace agreed immediately, relief flooding through her. It wasn't much money, but it was honest work, and it would keep her off the streets and away from the kinds of men who had made her life hell in Santa Fe. She threw herself into the job with a desperate intensity, working long hours and rarely taking breaks, as if staying busy could keep the memories at bay. Vincent saw her around town often over the following weeks. Sometimes she would be sweeping the porch of the general store, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon, and sometimes she would be carrying boxes of supplies that looked too heavy for her slender frame. He always nodded to her when their paths crossed, and sometimes she would nod back, though she never stopped to talk. He found himself thinking about her more than he should, wondering what had put that haunted look in her eyes and that defensive set to her shoulders. He knew better than to push her for answers, though. Women who had been hurt the way he suspected she had been needed time and space to heal, not some cowboy pestering them with questions. But fate, or maybe just the small-town nature of Montrose, kept throwing them together. One evening in late October, when the air had turned crisp and the leaves on the cottonwood trees along the creek were turning gold, Vincent was walking back to the boarding house, where he rented a room, when he heard shouting from the alley behind the saloon. He recognized Grace's voice immediately, high and tight with fear, and he was running before his brain had fully processed what he was hearing. He rounded the corner and saw Grace backed up against the wall of the saloon with a man looming over her, one hand on the wall beside her head and the other reaching for her arm. "Come on, sweetheart," the man was saying, his words slurred with drink. "Just a little kiss. That's all I'm asking for." "Get away from me," Grace said, and Vincent heard the tremor in her voice that she was trying to hide. "I said get away from her," Vincent growled, and his voice was low and dangerous in a way that made the drunk man turn around, swaying on his feet. "This is none of your business, Zarelli," the man said. Vincent recognized him as one of the ranch hands from a competing outfit, a troublemaker named Pete who had a reputation for being rough with women. "I'm making it my business," Vincent said, stepping closer. He was bigger than Pete by a good 4 inches and probably 50 pounds of muscle, and Pete seemed to realize that he was outmatched because he took a step back, his hands coming up in a placating gesture. "Fine, fine," Pete muttered. "Wasn't doing nothing anyway. The girl's not worth the trouble." He stumbled off down the alley, and Vincent watched him go to make sure he didn't double back. When he turned back to Grace, she was still pressed against the wall, her face pale and her breathing ragged. "You all right?" he asked gently. "I'm fine," Grace said automatically, but her voice shook and Vincent could see her hands trembling. "I could have handled it." "I'm sure you could have," Vincent said, keeping his tone neutral, "but you shouldn't have to." Grace looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. "Why do you keep showing up?" she asked. "Why do you keep helping me?" "Because someone should," Vincent said simply. "And because I know what it's like to feel like you're facing the world alone." Grace's eyes filled with tears and she blinked them back angrily. "I don't need your pity." "Good, because I'm not offering any," Vincent said. "Pity is useless, but friendship, that's something different, and I'm offering that if you'll take it." Grace stared at him for a long moment, and Vincent could see the war playing out behind her eyes. The part of her that wanted to trust him battling with the part that had learned trust was dangerous. Finally, she nodded, just a tiny dip of her chin, and Vincent felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized was tight. "Come on," he said. "Let me walk you back to your boarding house. It's getting dark." Grace fell into step beside him, and they walked in silence through the streets of Montrose. The town was settling in for the night, with lamps being lit in windows and the sound of a piano drifting out from the saloon. It should have been peaceful, but Grace couldn't shake the tension that had settled into her bones like cold. When they reached her boarding house, Vincent tipped his hat to her and said, "If Pete or anyone else bothers you again, you come find me. I'm usually at the ranch during the day, but in the evenings, I'm either at the saloon or my room at Miller's boarding house on the other end of town." "I can take care of myself," Grace said again, but this time there was less conviction in her voice. "I know," Vincent said. "But you don't have to anymore. Not all the time." Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and went inside, feeling his gaze on her back until she closed the door behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, her heart pounding, and wondered why his words had made her want to cry. After that night, something shifted between them. Grace still kept her distance, but she didn't flinch quite so badly when Vincent approached her, and sometimes she would even smile at him when he made a joke or told her a story about something that had happened at the ranch. Vincent, for his part, was patient in a way he hadn't known he could be, content to let her set the pace and take her time learning to trust him. November came, bringing with it colder temperatures and the first dusting of snow on the mountains that ringed Montrose. Grace had been in town for almost 2 months, and she was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, she could build a life here that wasn't defined by fear and running. Mrs. Patterson had given her a raise after seeing how hard she worked, and Grace had moved into a better room at the boarding house, one with a window that looked out over the mountains. She still had nightmares sometimes, dreams where she was back in Santa Fe with that man's hands on her and his breath hot on her face, and she would wake up gasping and reaching for the gun she kept under her pillow. But the nightmares were coming less frequently, and she was starting to sleep through the night more often than not. Vincent had become a constant presence in her life, though she couldn't quite figure out when that had happened. He would stop by the general store on his way through town to pick up supplies for the ranch, and he always took a few minutes to talk to her, asking about her day and telling her about his. He never pushed her for more than she was willing to give, never asked about her past or why she had come to Montrose, and she was grateful for that. One Saturday afternoon, in mid-November, Vincent came into the store looking more excited than Grace had ever seen him. "I did it," he said, his eyes bright. "I bought the land, 200 acres about 5 miles north of town with a creek running through it and enough grazing for a good-sized herd." Grace felt a genuine smile tug at her lips, the first real one she could remember in months. "That's wonderful, Vincent. Congratulations." "I'm going to build a house come spring," Vincent said, his words tumbling over each other in his enthusiasm. "Nothing fancy, just a solid cabin to start, but it'll be mine, my own place." "You've worked hard for it," Grace said. "You deserve it." Vincent's smile faded a little, and he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I want to show you the land," he said. "Tomorrow's Sunday and Mrs. Patterson closes the store. Would you come out with me? I'll bring a picnic lunch and we can make a day of it." Grace's first instinct was to say no, to retreat back behind the walls she had built around herself, but something made her hesitate. She looked at Vincent's hopeful expression and thought about how patient he had been with her, how he had never asked for anything in return for his kindness, and she found herself nodding. "All right," she said. "I'll come." Vincent's face lit up like she had given him the best gift in the world. "I'll pick you up at your boarding house at 9, he said. "Dress warm. It'll be cold." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a thin layer of frost covering everything in a glittering blanket. Grace dressed carefully in her warmest dress, and the coat she had bought with her first wages from the general store. And then she waited nervously by the window until she saw Vincent ride up on a horse with a second one trailing behind him. He helped her mount the spare horse, his hand steady and warm on her waist, and then they rode out of town together. The countryside around Montrose was beautiful in a stark, wild way, with rolling hills covered in brown grass and stands of pine trees that looked almost black against the pale sky. Vincent led her north along a trail that followed the Uncompahgre River, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the area. When they reached his land, Grace could immediately see why he had chosen it. The creek he had mentioned was really more of a small river, running clear and cold over smooth stones, and the land sloped gently up from the water to a rise that offered a view of the mountains in the distance. It was peaceful in a way that made Grace's chest ache with something she couldn't name. "What do you think?" Vincent asked, dismounting and coming to help her down from her horse. "It's beautiful," Grace said honestly. "You could build a good life here." "That's the plan," Vincent said. He pulled a blanket and a basket from his saddlebag and spread the blanket on a flat spot near the creek. "Come on, let's eat. I'm starving." They sat together on the blanket, and Vincent unpacked the lunch he had brought, bread and cheese and apples, along with a flask of cider. It was simple food, but it tasted better than anything Grace could remember eating in a long time, maybe because of the company or maybe because of the beauty of the place. They ate and talked, and for the first time in her life, Grace found herself telling someone about her past. She told Vincent about growing up in an orphanage in Missouri, about being sent out to work as a servant when she was 12, about the man who had taken her in and then tried to force himself on her when she was 15. She told him about running away and ending up in Santa Fe, about working in the saloon and fighting off advances every night, about the man she had killed when he wouldn't take no for an answer. Vincent listened to all of it without interrupting, his face grave and his eyes never leaving hers. When she finally ran out of words, he reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "You did what you had to do to survive," he said quietly. "Anyone who judges you for that is a fool." "The law won't see it that way," Grace said, her voice breaking. "If they find me, they'll hang me. It doesn't matter that he was trying to rape me. I'm just a saloon girl and he was a man with money and connections." "They're not going to find you," Vincent said firmly. "And even if they did, I wouldn't let them take you." Grace pulled her hand away and wrapped her arms around herself. "You can't promise that. You can't protect me from everything." "Maybe not," Vincent said, "but I can try, and I will for as long as you'll let me." Grace looked at him, at the determination in his face and the warmth in his eyes, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Because from the first moment I saw you, I knew you were someone special, someone worth knowing, worth fighting for, and the more time I spend with you, the more certain I am that I'm right." "You don't know me," Grace said desperately. "Not really. I'm not who you think I am. I'm damaged, broken. I'm not fit to be anyone's wife or sweetheart or anything else." "Who said anything about you being my wife?" Vincent asked, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice that made Grace look up in surprise. "I'm just saying I care about you as a person, Grace. Whatever happens beyond that, well, that's up to you. Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I don't know how to let someone get close. Every time I've tried, it's ended badly." "Then we'll figure it out together," Vincent said. He moved closer to her on the blanket and put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. Grace stiffened for a moment and then relaxed, letting herself lean into his warmth. They sat like that for a long time, watching the creek flow past and listening to the wind in the pine trees, and Grace felt some of the tension that had been living in her bones for as long as she could remember start to ease. The ride back to Montrose was quieter than the ride out, but it was a comfortable silence, and when Vincent helped Grace down from her horse outside her boarding house, he held her hand for just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," he said. "It meant a lot to me to share that place with you." "Thank you for showing me," Grace said. She hesitated and then added, "and for listening. About everything." "Anytime," Vincent said. He tipped his hat to her and rode away, and Grace stood watching him until he disappeared around a corner. Winter settled over Montrose in earnest after that, bringing snow and freezing temperatures that kept most people huddled inside by their fires. Grace continued working at the general store, and Vincent continued stopping by whenever he was in town, which seemed to be more and more often. They fell into a pattern of spending time together, sometimes just talking at the store and sometimes going for walks when the weather permitted. Grace found herself looking forward to seeing Vincent with an eagerness that both thrilled and terrified her. She had never felt this way about anyone before, had never let herself get close enough to someone to develop feelings. But Vincent had somehow slipped past her defenses without her even realizing it, and now she couldn't imagine her life without him in it. It was Vincent who first used the word love, on a snowy evening in January when they were sitting together in the back room of the general store after Grace had finished work. Mrs. Patterson had gone home early, trusting Grace to lock up, and Vincent had shown up with hot coffee and pastries from the bakery. They were sitting on a pile of flour sacks, their breath misting in the cold air when Vincent said, "I think I'm falling in love with you, Grace. Actually, I know I am. I just wanted you to know." Grace's heart stopped and then started again, beating so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. "Vincent, you can't," she said. "I told you I'm not fit to be anyone's wife. I'm too broken." Vincent set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "Then don't be my wife," he said. "Just be you, that's enough. It's always been enough." Grace stared at him, her eyes filling with tears for what felt like the 100th time since she had met him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't need you to be perfect or whole or anything other than who you are right now, in this moment," Vincent said. "I'm saying I love you for you, Grace, not for who you think you should be or who you're afraid you're not. Just you." "But I have nightmares," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I wake up screaming sometimes, and I don't know if I can ever be intimate with a man not after everything that's happened. What kind of marriage would that be? The kind where we figure things out as we go," Vincent said. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I'm not asking you to marry me right this second, Grace. I'm just asking you to let me love you and to maybe consider loving me back. Everything else we can work through together." Grace closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his hands against her cold cheeks. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," Vincent said, "but I'm not going anywhere. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here." Grace opened her eyes and looked at him, at the sincerity in his face and the love shining in those pale blue eyes, and she felt something shift inside her. It was like a door that had been locked for years suddenly swinging open, letting in light and air and the possibility of something she had never dared to hope for. "I think I might love you too," she said, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I know how to do it right, but I want to try. Vincent's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. That's all I'm asking, he said. He leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and Grace felt the last of her walls crumble. They courted through the rest of that winter and into the spring, taking things slowly and carefully. Vincent was endlessly patient with Grace's fears and moments of panic, never pushing her to go faster than she was comfortable with. They held hands and took long walks and talked about everything and nothing, and gradually, Grace began to believe that maybe she could have a future that wasn't defined by her past. In March, when the snow was starting to melt and the first signs of green were appearing on the hills, Vincent began building his house on the land he had bought. Grace would ride out with him on Sundays to watch the progress, and sometimes she would help by holding tools or mixing mortar. The cabin was taking shape slowly but surely, with solid log walls and a stone fireplace that Vincent built with his own hands. One Sunday in April, when the cabin's walls were up and the roof was on, Vincent took Grace inside and showed her the room he was building at the back. "This could be a bedroom," he said, "or an office or a nursery if we ever have children. But I wanted you to see it because I was thinking that if you wanted, when we get married, we could have separate rooms. At least at first, until you're comfortable with the idea of sharing a bed." Grace felt her eyes fill with tears again. She seemed to cry more now than she ever had before, but they were different kinds of tears, tears of gratitude and wonder instead of pain and fear. "You would do that?" she asked. "You would marry me even if we didn't share a bed?" "Grace, I would marry you under any circumstances you wanted," Vincent said. "I want you in my life however that looks. The rest is just details." Grace threw her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and sawdust and the soap he used. "Yes," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Yes, I'll marry you." Vincent wrapped his arms around her and held her tight, his heart pounding against her cheek. "You sure?" he asked, pulling back just enough to look at her face. "I'm sure," Grace said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. She was still scared, still haunted by her past, but she loved Vincent with a fierceness that surprised her, and she wanted to build a life with him more than she had ever wanted anything. They were married in June, in a simple ceremony at the church in Montrose with Mrs. Patterson and a few of Vincent's friends from the ranch as witnesses. Grace wore a blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and Vincent wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Grace could hardly breathe when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The ceremony itself was brief, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Vincent kissed her gently, his lips barely brushing hers. It was the first time they had kissed on the lips, and Grace felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with safety and belonging. They moved into the cabin together, and true to his word, Vincent gave Grace her own room. He never pressured her to share his bed, never made her feel like she owed him anything. They fell into a routine of running the ranch together, with Grace helping with the cooking and the chickens they had bought, while Vincent handled the cattle and the heavy labor. It was hard work, but it was satisfying in a way that Grace's previous jobs had never been. She was building something here, creating a life that was truly hers, and the nightmares that had plagued her for so long began to fade. She still had bad nights sometimes, nights when she would wake up gasping and terrified, but Vincent was always there, sitting beside her bed and holding her hand until she calmed down. 3 months into their marriage, on a warm night in September, Grace went to Vincent's room instead of her own. He was sitting up in bed reading by lamplight, and he looked up in surprise when she appeared in the doorway. "Grace, everything all right? I want to try," Grace said, her voice trembling but determined. "I want to try to be a real wife to you." Vincent set his book aside and stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of her. "You are a real wife to me," he said firmly. "Nothing needs to change." "But I want it to," Grace said. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you, Vincent, and I want to show you that. I'm still scared, but I trust you. And I think I'm ready." Vincent searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear, and when he found only determination and love, he nodded. "We'll go as slow as you need," he said. "And if you want to stop at any point, we stop. No questions asked." Grace nodded, and Vincent led her to the bed. What happened next was tender and careful, with Vincent constantly checking to make sure she was all right and Grace marveling at how different it could be when it was with someone who loved you and respected you. There were moments when old fears rose up and threatened to choke her, but Vincent was patient, holding her and talking her through it until she could breathe again. Afterward, Grace lay in Vincent's arms and felt something settle into place inside her, like a puzzle piece finally finding its home. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Vincent asked, his hand stroking her hair. "For being patient with me. For loving me even when I didn't think I deserved it. For showing me that I'm not as broken as I thought I was." "You were never broken," Vincent said firmly. "You were hurt, and that's not the same thing. Broken things can't heal, but hurt things can. And you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Grace smiled against his chest and let herself relax into the warmth of his body. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The years that followed were not without their challenges. The ranch demanded constant work, and there were times when money was tight and the weather was harsh, and it seemed like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But Grace and Vincent faced it all together, their love for each other deepening with each passing season. In the spring of 1880, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mix of joy and terror, memories of all the terrible things that could happen to women in childbirth, warring with excitement at the thought of having a child with Vincent. Vincent, for his part, was ecstatic, and he fussed over her so much that Grace finally had to tell him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. Their son was born in December, a healthy baby with Vincent's dark hair and Grace's green eyes. They named him Daniel, and Grace fell in love with him the moment she saw him. Holding her son in her arms, feeling his small body warm against her chest, Grace felt the last of her old wounds finally begin to heal. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She had been hurt and scared and traumatized, but she had survived, and now she was thriving. She had a husband who loved her unconditionally, a son who depended on her, and a home that was truly hers. 2 years later, they had a daughter, a little girl with blonde hair and her father's pale blue eyes. They named her Sarah, and she was as fierce and independent as her mother. Grace watched her children grow with a sense of wonder, marveling at how different their childhoods were from her own. They were safe and loved and free to be whoever they wanted to be, and Grace was determined to make sure they stayed that way. Vincent expanded the ranch over the years, buying more land and building up his herd until they were one of the most successful operations in the area. But he never forgot what was truly important, never let his ambition come before his family. Every evening, no matter how much work there was to be done, he would come home for dinner and spend time with Grace and the children. Grace herself became known in Montrose as a woman of strength and compassion. She helped Mrs. Patterson at the general store when extra hands were needed, and she became involved in organizing assistance for families who fell on hard times. She particularly focused on helping women who were in situations like the one she had been in, women who were running from abuse or trying to build new lives for themselves. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Vincent took Grace back to the spot where they had had their first picnic, the place where she had first told him about her past, and where he had first told her he was falling in love with her. They sat on a blanket by the creek, watching the water flow past, and Vincent said, "Do you remember what you told me that day? That you were too broken to be anyone's wife." "I remember," Grace said, smiling. "I was wrong." "You were wrong about being broken," Vincent agreed. "But you were right about one thing. You're not just my wife. You're so much more than that. You're my partner, my best friend, the mother of my children, and the love of my life. Just being you has always been enough. It always will be." Grace leaned over and kissed him, a long, slow kiss that held 10 years of love and trust and shared experiences. When they pulled apart, she said, "I love you, Vincent Zarelli. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." "I love you too, Grace Zarelli," Vincent said, "and I always will." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they packed up their blanket and rode back to the ranch together. Their children were waiting for them when they arrived, Daniel, now 9, and Sarah, now 7, running out to greet them with shouts of excitement. Grace dismounted and caught Sarah up in her arms, spinning her around as the little girl laughed with delight. Vincent lifted Daniel onto his shoulders, and together, the family walked into the house that Vincent had built with his own hands all those years ago. That night, after the children were in bed, Grace and Vincent sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out one by one. The night was warm and still, with the sound of crickets chirping in the grass and the distant call of an owl hunting in the darkness. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't come to Montrose?" Vincent asked. Grace considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with regret. Everything I went through, as terrible as it was, led me here. Led me to you and to this life we've built together. I wouldn't change that for anything." Vincent squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you came here. I can't imagine my life without you in it." "Me neither," Grace said softly. She leaned her head on his shoulder and looked up at the stars, feeling a peace and contentment that she had never thought possible when she had first ridden into Montrose all those years ago, frightened and alone and convinced that she would never be whole again. But she had been wrong. She had found wholeness not by fixing what was broken inside her, but by accepting that she was exactly who she was supposed to be, scars and all. And she had found it with a man who had seen her not for what she lacked, but for what she had, who had loved her not in spite of her past, but because of the strength it had given her. The years continued to pass, bringing with them new challenges and new joys. Daniel grew into a strong, kind young man who wanted to take over the ranch someday, while Sarah developed a passion for teaching and talked about becoming a school teacher like the one who had come to Montrose when she was 10. Grace and Vincent watched their children grow with pride and love, knowing that they had given them the childhood that neither of them had been fortunate enough to have. In 1895, when Grace was 40 years old, she stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out over the land that she and Vincent had built together. 17 years had passed since she had first arrived in Montrose, scared and running and certain that she would never be able to build a normal life. But here she was, with a husband who loved her, children who made her proud, and a home that was truly hers. Vincent came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Just remembering," Grace said. "Remembering what you told me all those years ago, about how I didn't need to be perfect or whole, that just being me was enough." "I meant every word," Vincent said. "Then and now." Grace turned in his arms and looked up at him. His hair was starting to gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "I know you did," she said, "and I want you to know that you saved me. Not by fixing me or changing me, but by loving me exactly as I was and giving me the space to heal on my own terms." "We saved each other," Vincent said. He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips. "I was just a cowboy with a dream before you came along. You gave me something to build for, someone to come home to. You made my life worth living." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears, tears of gratitude for the life they had built together. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Vincent said. "Always have, always will." They stood together on the porch as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of purple and gold. In the distance, they could hear Daniel calling the cattle in for the evening and Sarah practicing her reading lessons inside the house. It was the sound of family, of home, of a life well lived. Grace leaned into Vincent's embrace and closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on her face and the steady beat of her husband's heart against her back. She had been through hell and back, had faced things that would have broken a lesser person, but she had survived. More than survived, she had thrived. She had learned that being broken was not a permanent state but a temporary condition, one that could heal with time and love and patience. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for, that she could build a life worth living even when it seemed impossible. Most importantly, she had learned that love was not about being perfect or whole or having all the answers. It was about showing up, day after day, and choosing to trust someone with your imperfect, messy, beautiful self. It was about finding someone who would hold your hand through the darkness and celebrate with you in the light. And she had found that someone in Vincent, the cowboy who had seen her at her lowest and had chosen to love her anyway, who had told her that just being herself was enough and had spent every day since proving it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace thought about the young woman she had been when she first rode into Montrose, so certain that she was beyond saving. If she could go back and tell that young woman anything, it would be this: hold on. It gets better. You are not broken. You are not beyond repair, and someday, someone is going to love you exactly as you are and show you that you have always been enough. But she couldn't go back, could only move forward. And as she stood there in her husband's arms, surrounded by the life they had built together, Grace knew that moving forward was exactly what she intended to keep doing. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome, but she would face them the same way she had faced everything else, with courage, with determination, and with Vincent by her side. The night grew darker, and eventually Vincent said, "Come on, let's go inside. Sarah will have dinner ready soon, and I'm starving." Grace laughed and let him lead her into the house, into the warmth and light and love that waited there. This was her life now, these were her people, and this was her home. She had fought for it, bled for it, and she would protect it with everything she had. But more than that, she would cherish it every single day because she knew how rare and precious it was. She knew what it was like to have nothing, to be nothing in the eyes of the world, and that knowledge made her appreciate what she had now all the more. That night, after dinner was finished and the dishes were washed and the children were in bed, Grace and Vincent lay together in their bedroom, the same room they had shared for the past 9 years. Vincent's arm was around her and her head was resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Vincent," she said softly. Do you ever regret marrying me? Ever wish you had chosen someone easier, someone who didn't come with so much baggage?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, and then he shifted so he could look down at her face. "Grace Zarelli, I have never, Not once in all the years we've been married, regretted choosing you. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I would choose you again every single day for the rest of my life. You hear me? Grace nodded, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. I hear you. Good, Vincent said. He wiped away her tears with his thumb and then kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss that made Grace's toes curl. When they finally pulled apart, he said, "Now stop asking me foolish questions and go to sleep. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." Grace laughed and settled back against his chest, feeling the tension drain out of her body. She was loved, she was safe, and she was home. What more could anyone ask for? She drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, and her dreams that night were not of the past, but of the future, of all the years still to come with the man she loved and the family they had created together. In the spring of 1898, their daughter Sarah got married to a young teacher who had come to Montrose the year before. Grace stood beside her daughter at the wedding, feeling a bittersweet mixture of joy and sadness as she watched Sarah exchange vows with the man she loved. It seemed like just yesterday that Sarah had been a tiny baby in her arms, and now she was a grown woman starting her own life. But as Grace looked at the love shining in Sarah's eyes when she looked at her new husband, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had raised her daughter to be strong and independent and to know her own worth, and Sarah had chosen a man who respected and cherished her. That was all any mother could hope for. Daniel, now 18, had taken over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch, and he was proving to be as capable and hardworking as his father. Vincent was starting to talk about stepping back a bit, about spending more time just enjoying life with Grace instead of working from sunup to sundown. "We've earned it," he said one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. "We've built something good here, something that will last, and Daniel is more than ready to take over. Maybe it's time for us to take it a bit easier." Grace considered this and then nodded. "I think you might be right," she said. "I've spent so much of my life just trying to survive that I'm not sure I really know how to simply live. Maybe it's time I learned." Vincent reached over and took her hand. "Then we'll learn together," he said, "just like we've done everything else." And so they did. Over the next few years, Vincent gradually handed more and more responsibility for the ranch over to Daniel, while he and Grace focused on enjoying each other and the life they had built. They traveled a bit, taking trips to Denver and even once to San Francisco, marveling at how much the world had changed since they had first met. But no matter where they went or what they did, they always came back to Montrose, to the ranch that Vincent had carved out of the wilderness and the house he had built with his own hands. That was where they belonged, where they had put down roots and created a legacy that would outlast them both. In 1905, when Grace was 50 years old, she became a grandmother for the first time. Sarah gave birth to a daughter, a tiny, perfect little thing with wispy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. Grace held her granddaughter in her arms and felt her heart expand with a love she hadn't known was possible. "What are you going to name her?" Grace asked Sarah. Sarah looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and said, "Grace. We're going to name her Grace after you." Grace felt her own eyes fill with tears, and she handed the baby back to Sarah before she dropped her. "That's a beautiful name," she managed to say. "It's perfect," Sarah said, "because you're the strongest woman I know, and I want my daughter to grow up to be just like you." Grace had to leave the room after that because she was crying too hard to speak. Vincent found her a few minutes later, sitting on the porch steps with her face in her hands, and he sat down beside her and pulled her into his arms. "Happy tears?" he asked. "The happiest," Grace said. She looked up at him and smiled through her tears. "Can you believe it, Vincent? Me, a grandmother, the girl who thought she was too broken to ever have a family of her own. I always knew you would be, Vincent said. From the moment I met you, I knew you were going to do great things. Grace shook her head in wonder. You always had more faith in me than I had in myself. Someone had to, Vincent said with a grin. Then he grew serious and said, but you found that faith eventually, Grace. You learned to believe in yourself, to see yourself the way I've always seen you. And that's what matters. Grace leaned against him and looked out over the land they had worked together for so many years. The ranch was thriving, with cattle grazing on the hills and horses in the corral and chickens pecking in the yard. The house had been expanded over the years, with additions built on as the family grew, and it was warm and welcoming and full of love. This was her life, the life she had built from nothing but determination and love and the willingness to trust one man who had seen past her scars to the person underneath. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for, more than she had ever thought possible. And it all started with a simple choice, the choice to accept Vincent's friendship and then his love, the choice to believe him when he said that just being herself was enough. That choice had changed everything, had opened up a world of possibilities that she had never imagined. As Grace sat there with Vincent's arm around her, and the sound of her newborn granddaughter crying in the house behind them, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Gratitude for the second chance she had been given, gratitude for the man who had loved her when she couldn't love herself, gratitude for the family and the home and the life that had seemed so impossibly far out of reach all those years ago. "Thank you," she said to Vincent, her voice soft. "For what?" Vincent asked. "For everything," Grace said. "For seeing me, for loving me, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. For showing me that I didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of love. For building this life with me." Vincent tightened his arm around her and kissed the top of her head. "It was my privilege," he said. "Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life, and I wouldn't trade a single moment of it for anything." They sat together as the sun set and the stars came out, and Grace thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had been long and hard and painful at times, but it had also been beautiful and rewarding and full of more love than she had ever thought possible. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She had been hurt and scared and traumatized, but she had survived, and she had healed, and she had built a life that was richer and fuller than anything she could have imagined in her darkest days. And it had all started with a cowboy who had looked at her and seen not a damaged woman but someone worth knowing, someone worth loving, someone who was enough exactly as she was. The years continued to pass, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that are part of any life. There were births and deaths, triumphs and setbacks, moments of pure happiness and moments of deep grief. Through it all, Grace and Vincent stood together, their love for each other only growing stronger with time. In 1912, Vincent fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. For a terrifying week, Grace sat by his bedside, holding his hand and praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in to please let him live. She couldn't imagine her life without him, couldn't fathom facing the world alone again after all these years of having him by her side. Vincent pulled through, though it took him months to fully recover his strength. During that time, Grace nursed him with a fierce devotion, and Vincent would later say that her love was what had kept him fighting when it would have been easier to just let go. When he was finally well again, Vincent took Grace's hand and said, "I'm not going anywhere yet. I've still got too much living to do with you." "You better not," Grace said, trying to sound stern but failing miserably. "I'm not done with you yet, Vincent Zarelli." Vincent laughed, and Grace laughed with him, and they held each other close, grateful for another day, another year, another chance to love each other. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1918, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Daniel and his wife had given them 3 more grandchildren over the years, and Sarah had 2 more after little Grace. The house was full of noise and laughter, and the chaos that comes with a large family gathering, and Grace had never been happier. As she stood in the kitchen preparing food with Sarah and her daughters-in-law, she thought about the woman she had been 30 years ago, standing in this very kitchen on her wedding day, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. That woman would never have believed that she would end up here, surrounded by family and love and the evidence of a life well lived. But here she was. She had survived, she had thrived, and she had created something beautiful out of the ashes of her past. That night, after all the guests had gone home and the house was quiet again, Grace and Vincent sat together in their bedroom, holding hands and reflecting on the past 3 decades. 30 years, Vincent said wonderingly. Where did the time go? I don't know, Grace said. But I wouldn't change a minute of it. Not even the hard parts, Vincent asked. Not even the hard parts, Grace confirmed. Because the hard parts are what made us who we are. They're what taught us to appreciate the good parts even more. Vincent brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. You're a wise woman, Grace Zarelli. I learned from the best, Grace said, smiling at him. They lay down together, and Grace curled up against Vincent's side, feeling his warmth and his strength and his love surrounding her. This was where she belonged, where she had always belonged, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was the luckiest woman in the world. The 1920s brought more changes. The world was modernizing rapidly, with automobiles becoming more common and electricity reaching even small towns like Montrose. Grace and Vincent watched these changes with a mixture of fascination and bemusement, trying to keep up with a world that seemed to be moving faster and faster. But some things didn't change. Their love for each other remained constant, a steady anchor in a world of flux and uncertainty. They still took walks together in the evenings when the weather permitted, still sat on the porch and watched the sunset, still held hands and talked about everything and nothing. In 1928, on a warm summer evening, Vincent said to Grace, You know, I've been thinking about what I want to be remembered for when I'm gone. Grace felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of Vincent dying, even though she knew it was inevitable someday. And what's that? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I want to be remembered as the man who loved Grace Rivera, who became Grace Zarelli, Vincent said. Because that's the thing I'm most proud of in my entire life. Not the ranch, not the land, not any of the success we've had. But the fact that I got to love you and be loved by you in return. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. After all these years, Vincent could still make her cry with his words. I want to be remembered as the woman who was brave enough to let herself be loved by Vincent Zarelli, she said. Even when I was scared, even when I thought I wasn't worthy. That's what I'm most proud of. Vincent pulled her close and held her tight, and they stood there together as the sun set on another day, another year, another chapter of their lives together. In the spring of 1932, Vincent passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81. Grace was lying beside him when it happened, and she knew the moment he left her, felt the change in the air like a physical thing. She lay there for a long time, holding his hand and saying goodbye to the man who had been her everything for 54 years. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to pull her under. But Grace had survived worse, and she was determined to honor Vincent's memory by living the rest of her life with the same courage and grace that he had always believed she possessed. She stayed on the ranch with Daniel and his family, helping out where she could and spending time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the man he had been, and the love they had shared. She wanted them to know that love was real, that it was possible, that it was worth fighting for no matter how scared you were. Grace lived for another 12 years after Vincent's death, and she spent that time being the matriarch of the family they had created together. She attended weddings and funerals, births and graduations, always offering wisdom and love to anyone who needed it. She particularly made a point of talking to the young women in the family, telling them about her own experiences and encouraging them to be strong and independent and to never settle for less than they deserved. She wanted them to know that they were not defined by what happened to them, but by how they chose to respond to it. In the summer of 1944, Grace passed away at the age of 89. She died peacefully, surrounded by family, with a smile on her face and Vincent's name on her lips. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, not just family but members of the community who had been touched by her kindness and her strength over the years. People told stories about how Grace had helped them when they were struggling, how she had offered words of encouragement when they needed them most, how she had been a light in the darkness for so many. As they lowered her casket into the ground next to Vincent's, Sarah stood with her own children and grandchildren and thought about the legacy her mother had left behind. It wasn't just the ranch or the family or the material things, though those were all important. It was the lesson that Grace had taught through her life, that you could survive anything, overcome anything, if you had courage and love and the willingness to trust. Grace had come to Montrose broken and afraid, convinced that she would never be whole again. But she had found love with a cowboy who had seen her not for what she lacked, but for what she had, who had told her that just being herself was enough, and in the end, it had been more than enough. Grace had built a life that was rich and full and meaningful, had raised children who loved her, and left behind a legacy that would last for generations. She had proven that being broken was not a permanent condition, that healing was possible, that love could triumph over even the darkest past. And that was a lesson worth remembering, worth passing down, worth living by. As the mourners dispersed, and the sun set over the ranch that Grace and Vincent had built together all those years ago, their great-granddaughter Grace, now a young woman of 22, stood by the graves and made a silent promise. She would live her life with the same courage and strength that her great-grandmother had shown. She would never let anyone make her feel like she was less than she was, and she would always remember that just being herself was enough. It was a lesson that had been passed down through the generations, from Grace to Sarah to the next generation and the next. And it would continue to be passed down, a reminder of the woman who had refused to be defined by her past and the man who had loved her exactly as she was. The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the sound of the creek that ran through the property and the distant lowing of cattle on the hills. This land had witnessed so much over the years, struggle and triumph, heartbreak and joy, death and birth and everything in between. But most of all, it had witnessed love, the kind of love that transforms, that heals, that makes all things possible. The kind of love that Vincent and Grace had shared, that had started with a simple offer of friendship and had grown into something that would outlast them both. Their story would be told and retold in the years to come, changing slightly with each telling but always keeping the essential truth at its heart, that a broken woman and a patient cowboy had found each other in a small town in Colorado and had built a love that would stand the test of time. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. Not the hardships they had faced or the obstacles they had overcome, but the fact that they had faced them together, that they had chosen each other day after day, year after year, until death finally parted them. It was a love story for the ages, set against the backdrop of the Wild West, but timeless in its message. It was the story of Grace Rivera, who thought she was too broken to be loved, and Vincent Zarelli, who told her that just being herself was enough. And it was enough. It was always enough.